Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for making time to be here with us for our May task force meeting. I just remind people that May is Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. This month, we celebrate the culture, the history, achievements of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. I invite you to share in the chat anything that may be happening in your community in that celebration. And that's really, as we've seen over and over again, educating people about different cultures and history is the best antidote to the kind of bias that we've been seeing in so many of our communities. I want to start by sharing with you an update on a matter we talked about last fall, and many of you may have seen on the news. We had conducted a 9-month investigation, which began really just about a year ago, when we were seeing an incredible number of house breaks that were targeting homeowners who were either Indian or Southeast Asian. And if you've ever had your house broken into, you know how evasive just that is, having somebody in your space and touching your things and taking some of your property. But when it is because of who you are, it is even more traumatizing. And we I guess it's almost 2 weeks ago now, were able to arrest 4 individuals in Rhode Island. We charged them with 43 burglaries across 25 towns in Middlesex County. It was a very sophisticated and disciplined group. They were very high tech. They were going into people's houses, and initially, and we still haven't completely figured out how they knew, but they were going into houses when people were not at home. Originally, it was people that were away for some extended period of vacation or something. As they got bolder, they were actually doing breaks when people were out for the evening. They were going in ways that they managed to avoid cameras and ring doorbells and all of those things. They were very disciplined about never using their cell phones among the group, either in the going or the coming or while they were in that area. And they were also using signal jammers to block any kinds of alarms. So people on the street who might be streaming a movie or a sporting event or something would suddenly have their streaming go off for no apparent reason. It would disappear for a half an hour or so and then come back on. And it was because they were actually using blockers. They took from those homes in excess of $4 million in property, primarily jewelry, which was in large part really part of people's heritage. It was jewelry that had been passed down for generations, often that people would have in their house because it was, for instance, wedding season or something. And even though they might have stored the jewelry at a bank or someplace, they'd taken it out to wear it. Many of the people, just to give you a sense of how brazen these people were, many of the people who kept the jewelry in their home actually had safes, very large safes in some cases. In one case, the safe itself weighed over 400 pounds. And they were able to literally drop it out of a second floor window and take the whole safe. So we arrested them. We charged them with that in a really unusual but great development. We were able to recover a fair amount of property. That investigation is ongoing, but in a very concerning way, we not only found in executing the search warrants things like the jammers, but we found car trackers. We also found what appear to be sort of membership lists from various houses of worship. So they clearly were targeting people depending on where they belonged. Probably also could figure out if the temple was having an event on Thursday night or something. A large number of these people wouldn't be in their homes. So they were timing that. So that is a part, and we are now looking at whether or not, in addition to all the property crimes they can be charged with, they can also be charged with some kind of hate crime. And if they cannot, that is a piece that we're going to be filing some legislation on, because it's not clear that around property crimes, You can be charged with that, but we are working on that. So that's gotten a lot of attention. It got a lot of attention at the time. And we're happy to be bringing that to some resolution. I also want to talk a little bit, and you can certainly go on our website and see some of the videos and the great pictures. Last week, we hosted over 300 girls at Newton City Hall for our annual Empowering Girls Conference, one of my favorite days of the year. It is targeted at middle and high school girls across the county. The idea is really for them to see a vision of different things that women can be doing. Our theme was focused on the Hopi tribe proverb that those who tell the stories rule the world. And we wanted to really impress on the girls that by telling their personal stories, they can connect with others and really forge some relationships. We were incredibly fortunate to have Lauren Pratentis, who is the director of the National Security Council at the White House as our keynote speaker. Her insight about leadership and resilience was really exceptional. She also brought with her, which I think was amazing for the girls. She talked in her story about how she'd been greatly influenced by the fact that her grandmother was a child survivor of the Holocaust. And so she went through this story of how her grandmother had influenced her. And when she got to the end, and I am sure, as many of you know, if you deal with young people, I think they were thinking that the Holocaust happened around the time that the dinosaurs were roaming the earth. She then introduced her now 94-year-old grandmother. And I think that just gave a whole different perspective to the kids. So we had a variety of other folks with us, including my personal favorite, I think the first female commander of the USS Constitution, who in sort of a great story, grew up in Kentucky, had never really been anywhere near boats or water, and at age 6 was exposed to some information about the Navy Academy and decided she was going to go to Annapolis, and on a trip to Boston with family decided she was going to work on the Constitution, to which her parents, of course, understandably kind of said, "Oh, that's nice, honey." And now she is the commander of the USS Constitution. So it was a great day. If you want to look at it, I again recommend our website. Alice Casey's got lots more information, and she's putting her contact in the chat. So those are just some things that we are doing. But turning to our topics for today, as everyone knows, in Massachusetts, the number of immigrants living with us has grown sharply. There have been several reports published addressing those struggles over the last couple of years. Massachusetts has now spent just about $1 billion sheltering homeless families and migrants. And today we're going to focus on those newcomers in Massachusetts high school and discuss our progress in terms of meeting educational needs and social needs for folks. And keeping in mind that, you know, however people arrive here in Massachusetts, they really bring diverse perspectives and they have skills and cultures that enrich our communities. And it's important to recognize and celebrate those contributions rather than really getting caught up in the misconceptions and the stereotypes. And, you know, we've all seen those debates in various communities and how they have responded. And, you know, the difference between some communities, for instance, we're fortunate to have Concord here. Concord probably has the most incredible response that they have had to migrants that have moved into the community in terms of the shelter that's being run there and the way the whole community has come together around that. The same is true with some of the other communities out Route 2. And then in some places, it's just been harder. And that, in keeping in mind, especially with respect to kids, that discrimination and bias can really affect newcomers, making their distress and their alienation even deeper. And for students, it can't help but impact their academic performance, their overall well-being, and their future possibilities, whether they stay in school, finish school, how they're doing in school. So our speakers today are going to give us a really broad view of what we are doing for immigrant newcomers, and then we'll focus on the county to discuss the trends and the best practices to address the unmet needs. I'm really thrilled to have with us today Dr. Ann Mantell, who is the Senior Research Associate at the Annenberg Institute and a member of the Educational Opportunity in Massachusetts Progress Project Team. Her research interests include charter schools, desegregation, school choice programs, the evaluation of educational interventions that are really designed to close achievement gaps. She's worked for 9 years as a charter school teacher, she did work for 9 years as a charter school teacher and administrator in Oakland and in Washington, D.C. She holds a master's in public administration from the Woodrow Wilson School of International Affairs and a doctorate in education from the Graduate School of Education. So, Doctor, we're happy to have you here this morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Would you like me to go ahead or will you?
Sure.
Okay. Fantastic. All right, wonderful. Thank you, everyone. Just give me one moment and I'll share my screen. All right, everyone can see that?
Mm-hmm.
All right, great. So thank you so much for the opportunity to be here today. I'm going to be presenting the results of a report that we've done called Rising Numbers, Unmet Needs, Immigrant Newcomers in Massachusetts High Schools. And this work comes out of a longstanding research practice partnership between Brown University on the one hand and DESE on the other. So the focus of this report is newcomers across the state of Massachusetts. So I'll run through the key findings of the report, and then I'm going to turn it over to Rania Caldwell, who's going to sort of talk about this in one local context, which is Woburn Public Schools. So we'll start big and we'll zoom in as we go. To begin, I wanted to just make sure we're all on the same page in terms of how we're defining newcomers. So for the purposes of our work, we define newcomers as English learners, ELs, in their first 12 months of schooling in the United States. And so we have data on newcomers in Massachusetts public schools starting in the 2007-08 school year, running up to the present. Now, for this report, DESE really suggested that we focus initially on newcomers who are entering grades 9 through 12, high school newcomers. And I think the motivation arises from real concern over newcomers, immigrant newcomers who are arriving relatively late in their school careers and how little time they have to learn English, to earn high school course credits, to pass the MCAS, right, to meet all those graduation requirements in order to progress successfully through high school. So that's the initial focus. We are certainly hopeful that we will extend this work eventually to include newcomers who are younger when they arrive as well. So one of the pieces of this work has involved speaking with district and school level educators who work with newcomers. And I wanted to actually kick this off by sharing with you a couple of quotes. These come from Yvette Martinez, who is the Welcome Center director. She's sort of the first point of contact for newcomers and their families looking to enroll in public schools in Lynn. So the first quote is, one of the questions we ask them on the needs assessment form is, why do you, I just have to move that, want to go to school? Most of them say, I want to learn English. I want to participate in sports. I want to go to college. I have never been able to go to school. I am really excited. They believe they are going to school to learn English. So I think this quote represents sort of the opportunity and the optimism that newcomers bring with them when they arrive to Massachusetts public high schools. But then there's another side of this coin, right, which is our staff want to make them feel welcome because they usually come very afraid and scared and lost and confused. So the first thing is, you're welcome here. You're not alone. We want to explain how school works here. It's very different from other countries. The calendar is different, uniform, lunches, transportation, everything is different. For them, it's like a whole new world, right? So in this quote, I think it surfaces the tremendous challenges that newcomers face, right? They face a relatively steep journey. They've already completed an arduous journey to get here in many cases, but now there's a real challenge associated with having relatively little time, as I mentioned, to learn English and to fulfill local and state graduation requirements. So in our work, we want to highlight 6 key findings. I'll run through them here and then give you a little detail about them. So first, over the past 15 years, the number of high school newcomers in Massachusetts has nearly tripled, and the population has changed in fairly dramatic ways. We see that more districts in the state are serving newcomers than ever before, but newcomers remain relatively concentrated in a few high schools in the state. The profiles of newcomers differ dramatically from district to district. And then over on the right, we have some findings about newcomers' outcomes, how they do when once they arrive and start to attend school. We find that most newcomers are not meeting annual growth targets for English language proficiency. We find that the Commonwealth's Competency Determination Policy, the CD policy, which is the requirement that students pass all 3 high school MCAS tests in order to graduate, that policy disproportionately affects newcomers. And finally, when we look at high school completion and college enrollment, we see that the rates for newcomers are relatively low. So let me start with newcomer demographics. Who's coming? So over the past 15 years, as I mentioned, the number of newcomers has nearly tripled. So in this chart, we see the years along the bottom. The total bars represent the total number of newcomers each year. And if you focus just on the total bars for a minute, you'll see a fairly steady upward climb in the number of newcomers arriving, with the exception of 2021, which was, of course, during the pandemic, when travel and migration were really restricted. So now within each bar, the colors show where newcomers are enrolling. So the dark blue sections of each bar at the bottom are students who enroll in urban districts other than Boston. And then the red is Boston Public Schools, or BPS. And then the teal section at the very top is kind of everywhere else, non-urban areas in the state. So we see that while all of these 3 categories have seen growth in terms of numbers, the share has changed a little bit. So about 13% of newcomers went to BPS in 2023, basically now, but that compares to 20% in 2008. So BPS's share of newcomers has actually been declining a bit over time, right? And newcomers are going more to other districts, particularly some of these other urban districts like Lynn, for example. But one thing I want to emphasize is that given the rise in migrant families that have been coming into the state beginning last summer, I think that we can safely say patterns of newcomer enrollment are likely to be very dynamic for some time to come. So more specifically, newcomers are clustered in many large urban districts, some of which are shown here on the map. So we see, the largest concentrations in Boston and in Lynn, but we also see, fairly sizable numbers of newcomers in other urban areas like Framingham, Lowell, Worcester, Brockton, right? So most of these urban districts have seen very large increases since 2008 in the number of newcomers that they're welcoming. And half of 2023 newcomers, the most recent group that we can look at, attended one of only 16 high schools. Of course, those high schools are largely in these districts that we're identifying here. So there's this real concentration of newcomers within these larger urban districts. But the flip side of this story is that there's also quite a bit of dispersion of newcomers around the state. When we look at districts that serve at least 5 high school newcomers, we see that 103 districts fall in that category now, compared to only 59 in 2008. So yes, it's true, newcomers are clustered, but it's also true that there's a lot of districts around Massachusetts who did not have a long history of serving many newcomers and suddenly now are experiencing some growth. And then I wanted to show you a little bit about how the characteristics of newcomers who are arriving have changed. So this is the same graph that I showed you before in terms of the total numbers, but now the colored sections of each bar are showing you the first language spoken by newcomers. And the light blue section at the bottom is Spanish. The dark blue section, where you see, a much large growth in the share over time, is Portuguese. So that's been an interesting change. And in fact, when you look at the number of newcomers who speak Spanish or Portuguese, that's 84% of them in 2022, compared to only 42% in 2008, right? So much more concentration in 2 languages, which is not to say that there's not a lot of additional languages that are spoken, but much more concentration by language in who's arriving. And we also see a change in how much English students know when they arrive. So this is data taken from the Access test, which is the state's sort of English language proficiency assessment. It's given once a year to all English learners, but here we're looking specifically at high school newcomers. And what we see is the percentage of newcomers that score in that very lowest level on the Access when they arrive, right? And that percentage who speak very little English has been growing, right? So we see that now it's about 2/3 of newcomers come in with very low levels of English proficiency, and that compared to about 58% in 2017, right? And then just to return to this idea about district variation, I mean, I think newcomer profiles are very different across some of these large districts that we were talking about before. So here we're showing the each district's newcomer population broken out by language. And we see kind of 3 distinct categories here. First is districts like Lawrence and Lynn, where you see almost all of their pie chart is this light blue, which is Spanish, right? So nearly all newcomers to districts like Lawrence and Lynn are Spanish speaking. Boston and Springfield also have large majorities of Spanish-speaking newcomers. Then there's a category where at least half of newcomers are speaking Portuguese. And so Framingham, Malden, and Everett, to a lesser extent, would fall into this category. And then we have districts like Quincy and Brockton and others where newcomers are speaking many different languages. Right, so in Brockton, we see the orange and the purple. Those represent substantial shares of Creole speakers from Haiti and Criollo speakers from Cape Verde. In Quincy, that white section of the pie, a lot of those students are Chinese speakers. Right, so there's different languages, but there's this real diversity, this real heterogeneity by language in districts in the 3rd category. Right. So now, how does this all relate to newcomer outcomes? How do these students do in school and beyond? And what does their demographics tell us, or how does that relate to their outcomes? So one very important outcome that gets a lot of attention in Massachusetts is the MCAS. So we see here that just over half of newcomers eventually pass all 3 of the high school MCAS tests. So it's English Language Arts, math, and science. So just over half do go on to pass at least one. What's interesting about this pie chart, I think, is the next largest group, the next biggest piece of this pie, is the 24% of newcomers who never actually take all 3 tests. So these are students who are not in the state's public schools long enough to sit for all three tests, which speaks to kind of the mobility of this population, right? Students are transferring to a different state, they might be going back to their home countries, et cetera. So before the pandemic, and during the pandemic, the MCAS requirements were waived in different ways for different cohorts. So, but before all that happened, before the pandemic, newcomers made up only 4% of high school students who were attempting one of these tests, but they represented 32% of those who never passed at least one. So again, this real disproportionate effect of the competency determination policy on high school newcomers in particular. And then high school graduation and dropout rates are also outcomes of real interest. So here we're showing both of those on a single graph, and we'll start at the top with the solid lines. The dark green line shows newcomers' graduation rate over time. And the dark blue solid line shows non-newcomer English learners. So these are English learners, they're still learning English, but they have been in the country for longer, right? And presumably in school in the US for longer. So what we see is back in 2011, those two groups were graduating at virtually identical rates. And then there's been this real divergence over time where the graduation rate for non-newcomer English learners has been going up quite steadily, including during the pandemic, which is shown here in kind of the gray part of the plot. But we see that the newcomer graduation rate never rose above 60% until the pandemic happened and MCAS requirements were waived. So that's certainly suggestive evidence, again, of how much the CD policy is affecting this group of students. The dotted lines at the bottom of the graph are dropout rates. And you see that during this period, the dropout rate for non-newcomer English learners was falling slightly, but still noticeably. And at the same time, the dropout rate for newcomers was slightly increasing, right? So again, moving in kind of different directions. In case you're interested in percentages, they're over here on the right. From the 2018 cohort, which is again the last cohort that we can look at, with no pandemic impact, just over half of students graduated. 18% of newcomers in that cohort dropped out. Another 18% transferred. And then 7% earned a certificate of attainment. That means that they had fulfilled all their local district's graduation requirements, but could not pass at least one of those MCAS tests. And another 3% were still enrolled. All right. And then the last finding I wanted to share with you is about college enrollment. And here the story is even more dramatic. We see that college enrollments of newcomers have declined steeply, both before and during the pandemic. So here we're showing three groups of students. Newcomers, again, are in the dark green. Non-newcomer English learners are the dark blue again. And then at the top, you see kind of everyone else, non-English learners and former English learners. And so before the pandemic, there was a nice, steady, very high college enrollment rate for the top group, some modest increases for non-newcomer ELs. But when you look at newcomers, starting in as early as 2015, the college enrollments began to decline quite a bit. And that's a trend that only continued and maybe accelerated during the pandemic. So that we see that by the class of 2020, the percentage that was going on to enroll in college within 3 years of their expected high school graduation was maybe 25%. So that's a fairly dramatic and disturbing story. So what might be explaining some of these trends that we've been seeing in newcomers' outcomes? I think I want to draw this back to variation in who newcomers are and in the skills they bring with them, because I think that's an important part of the story. So we looked at newcomers. Instead of treating them as one monolithic group, we broke them into language country groups. So for example, the first language country group I'm showing you here is Spanish speakers who come from the Northern Triangle region of Central America. So that's the three countries of Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, right? And so that group accounted for 10% of newcomers in 2008, but now it's a quarter of newcomers. So big growth in this group over time. And we see here in the map the 5 districts that receive the most students from the Spanish Northern Triangle group. And then in the middle, Portuguese speakers from Brazil. This is another group where the share, their numbers and the share of total newcomers that they make up have risen a lot over time. And what's interesting, I think, is when you look at this map, you see that the districts that these students are going to are completely different. There is no overlap between those districts and the districts where Spanish speakers from the Northern Triangle are enrolling, which is really interesting. And then finally, over on the right, there's Creole speakers from Haiti. And in the high school data, it looks like that group has been shrinking. But of course, there's a big asterisk here, because we know anecdotally from media coverage that a lot of immigrant families that are arriving now are from Haiti. And so I would imagine that those numbers are going to shift as we get more recent data on students who are enrolling, like right now. So why does this matter for outcomes? It matters because when we look at within these groups, we see really large differences in skills and in outcomes. So I'm showing here just 2 of them, just the Spanish speakers from the Northern Triangle and Creole speakers from Haiti, just to show you the contrast. So how much English do students know when they arrive? 92% of the Spanish speakers from the Northern Triangle score at the very lowest level of English proficiency when they first enroll, right? So they're coming in with very little English compared to only 43% of Creole speakers from Haiti. And not surprisingly, I suppose, then we see differences in terms of how they progress through school. So a quarter of the Spanish speaking group is retained in 9th grade. They don't, they're not promoted to 10th grade after their first 9th grade attempt. That compares to only 11% of newcomers from Haiti. High school dropout rates are very different. 39% of the Northern Triangle newcomers drop out, compared to only 6% of the group from Haiti. And graduation rate, it's the opposite. 37% of Spanish speakers from the Northern Triangle are graduating, compared to 78%. So very large difference. And then the largest difference here is the last one. Of the students who actually graduate from high school, 22% of the Spanish Northern Triangle students go on to college, 82% of Creole speakers from Haiti, right? So there's many underlying factors that would explain why we see these differences. But my point here is just that it's very important not to treat newcomers as, one single kind of monolithic group, but to think more about specific populations of newcomers within districts, where they're coming from, what their needs are, what customized supports and interventions we might provide. So I'm going to turn this back to Rania after just running through these key takeaways. Patterns in where newcomers come from and where they enroll are very dynamic, even within a short window of time. Newcomers continue to be concentrated in urban districts, but more districts are enrolling newcomers now than ever before. The profiles of newcomers differ dramatically across districts, which we just were talking about. The Commonwealth's CD policy disproportionately affects newcomers. And finally, high school completion and college enrollment rates for this population are relatively low. So I will leave it there. Thank you so much, and turn it over to Rania.
Thank you. Questions, comments? People can raise your hand, put them in the chat.
I just have one quick question. On the second to last slide, is it intentional of where our newcomers are being placed in the districts or towns and cities? Because where you said there was no overlap between Portuguese speaking and Spanish speaking, I was just wondering, is that intentional or is that just how placement happened with our newcomers? I don't know if Dr. Mantle heard me or she's on mute.
Sorry, I forgot.
Okay, you get it?
There we go.
Sorry.
So this is the slide you're talking about, right?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Yes. So yeah, in terms of where students are enrolling, it depends entirely on where their families or either their families are choosing to go or where they currently have family, right? So yeah, there's nothing intentional about from a policy perspective about who ends up where. I think in Lynn, for example, which is the big destination for Spanish speakers from the Northern Triangle, and Rania can speak to this more than I can, but there's a very large community of families who have come from Central America and continue to have other additional members of their extended families joining them, and so that's kind of a destination that many families from Central America choose in Massachusetts. But I think it's very interesting. For example, Brockton has as many of you probably know, a long standing immigrant community from Haiti. And so they also are a big destination for immigrants from that country. But I just think it's very interesting that these maps look so different for different groups, right? Because depending on the community, who you are welcoming is it's just very different.
Reverend Lloyd.
Yeah, I think one question I had is a follow. Well, is with what Antonio just mentioned in terms of the nature of destination, and therefore that has a large bearing on where the concentrations are, and consequently, questions become: if we have this kind of data, what are we doing beyond this idea of measurement of graduation to accommodate the fact is that in a certain places, this is the highest population and what that means. But that's a bigger question, what have you. The more question of this idea that within our numbers, are we talking about also the folk who may land in the United States, but then eventually land in Massachusetts in these communities? In other words, some of these are fresh off the boat. This is where we are, it's destination. But then, as you mentioned, I think there was one slide, you said 18% in terms of transfer.
Exactly.
That's
Yeah.
large.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So what is that all incorporated in this number, or do you plan to sort that out? Because that has an effect, I think, in terms of the next time you do this in numbers, in terms of migrants, right? That are recent migrants that are here, and what
Yeah.
that skews the number.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's right. So our definition of newcomers is it's supposed to be English learners that are in their first 12 months of schooling in the US. So we want to exclude students who, for example, first went to Texas and were in Texas for 3 years and then moved here, right? And so it's not possible for us to be 100% sure that we have accounted for all of those students. There is a data report from districts where they are supposed to report, is this student in their first 12 months of schooling in the US or not? I don't know that districts, and again, Ronnie can speak to this more than I can, but I don't know that districts always know. But to the extent that they can, they are sharing that data with the state. And so that's the data we're using.
Right. Thank you. That was very interesting and helpful in just kind of getting an overview of where we are. So thank you very much for being with us. Rania Caldwell, who is our next speaker, holds an educational specialist degree, and she's the director of multilingual learners in Woburn. She brings over 20 years of experience to that job. She has been an English as a second language teacher, an instructional coach, and administrator in diverse urban and suburban districts. She currently serves on the world-class Instructional Design and Assessment Local Educational Agency Advisory Committee. And she's been selected as the executive committee representative. She actively contributes to national educational practices. She's been, as you can tell, a really dedicated advocate for multilingual learners. She presents nationally, locally, emphasizing equity-centered shifts in education to support culturally and linguistically diverse students in our schools. Her work really reflects that passion she has for fostering inclusiveness and effective educational environments so that multilingual students can be successful. So I'm happy to have you here and welcome you to present to us. And I noticed, if I can back up for 1 second, I noticed a couple of people maybe had questions before, but hopefully, Dr. Mantle, you and Rania would also take some questions at the end. So thank you, Rania.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And every time I see that research report, I am both amazed and shocked at the same time because, all right, everyone can see this. Because when that report was written, I was part of that work in the Lynn Public Schools, which I'll talk a little bit about my background. Okay. All right, hopefully folks can see that slide deck. All right, I don't have the fancy graphics that Ken has. All right, so as was mentioned, you know, I've been in the field for about 20 years now, which is a little scary to admit, actually, and have been an ML director since 2017, my first 6 years in the Lynn Public Schools, so very much familiar with that data in Lynn and the population that entered during that time and was living that every day, trying to, you know, make sure our systems worked for the kids who were entering our schools. And I think, you know, in addition to what was mentioned in my bio, you know, when I began in education, you know, you start in education because you love kids and the passion of kids and seeing them grow and learn. So really my focus was on instructional practices, and not until I became an ML director did I really understand the legalities and the civil rights that really need to be understood to best meet the needs of our kids in our schools. Because yes, we need strategies, but we need to understand that students have very specific rights in our schools, and they're not necessarily designed in a way to support those students. So now I'm currently in Woburn, so started here last August, and you know, was coming from Lynn, so a very different demographic. So Woburn Public Schools has steadily increased their EL demographic in recent years, from 9% in 2020 to 14.1. We're at about 14.7 now. But in 2016, it was 5.5. So the district has really seen a steady increase of English learners in the district. But really this year, with the increase of students that we've seen, there has been a heightened awareness of how many multilingual learners actually are in the schools and in classrooms. So the next data chart is the languages represented in the Woburn Public Schools. So just like the data that Anne presented earlier, you know, Portuguese is our largest demographic of speakers here, Brazilian Portuguese, followed by Spanish, which is very different than my experience in Lynn, where the majority of students were from Central America and Spanish speaking. What is interesting about this is this Haitian Creole data point, which Anne mentioned that maybe this is not represented quite yet, is here in Woburn, there wasn't even a percentage for Haitian Creole speakers until this year. And now with the emergency shelters and the students who are coming in from Haiti, it's at 8.5%. So a very different language group than what was familiar here in Woburn. and that also heightened that awareness. So collectively here, our students represent 55 countries and 48 languages, but these are really our largest buckets. So I think one thing when we talk about multilingual learners in schools, and I talked a little bit about the design of schools, but how we structure our schools and support students who are in our schools. What was impressive to me about Woburn is that prior to the newly arrived students coming here, they had an EL coordinator role, and they increased that role to become an EL director. And that happened before the shift in demographics here. So it demonstrated an awareness that the leadership had in how our demographics were changing, and realized the importance of having an elevated position to oversee that work. What it did also do was, create this heightened awareness. When those students began arriving, people really started to become aware of, how do we do this? This system doesn't work for this particular group of students. We have Portuguese translators, but we don't have translators for our Haitian students who are coming in. So it really did expose a lot of gaps in the existing system. So when you think about a Woburn versus a Lynn, who's had those students coming in for years at this point, a lot of those systems already established. When you're talking about communities like Woburn, those systems are not yet established, and the resources in the community are also less. So there's less resources to tap into when those students are coming into communities. What I have noticed in my first year here is how engaged educators and leaders are in learning more about students, which is so incredibly important, because what can happen when you have newcomers coming into districts is you can either have people who are really like, I want to know more, I want to do better, and people who might be more resistant to that work. And so far, I mean, we have had teachers engage in professional learning. They have choices of what they can participate in for their professional learning. They have up to like 20 options. We've had 400 educators get a certificate in a course focused on multilingual learners, simply based on the increase of students that we have seen this year. So teachers are recognizing that there's a disconnect that's happening in classrooms, and they're really working hard to do better and know better. And I think the last point is important because people want to learn, but they're also recognizing there's a need to unlearn, right? When you have spent years and decades in a system that is not centered multilingual learners, there are things you have to unlearn in order to move forward and really support those kids. And I think that comes to unveiling our blind spots, right? And, when we talk about systems and discrimination and bias, right, we all have blind spots. And that truly does exist with multilingual learners and immigrant students as well. And something in Woburn that we've been really highlighting is you don't know what you don't know. So how do we learn more and get better? And this is true for me as well. I was an ESL teacher and an ESL coach focused on instruction. And not until I was a new director, I just want to emphasize this before I say the next statement, not until I was a director with a civil rights investigation on my desk, did I really begin to truly understand the foundational rights of students. It really was always just about instruction. And once you see that, it's really hard to unsee it and how it plays out in schools. And that's really where my advocacy work began, because there are so many systems that are still not structured for the students that we serve. So this is a slide that I actually present to district administrators and school administrators often, because it's a way to recognize that we are all part of this monolingual system that we've been trained in. So when it comes to MLs and immigrant youth, our traditional resources in education and probably across fields, right, uphold a white English proficient standard. So when you're reading resources in your educator prep program, the books on your bookshelf, they typically center English proficient students who were born and raised in the United States. Many leaders, people who were educators a long time ago, probably didn't have English learners in their classroom because there is a history of segregating English learners from English proficient peers in Massachusetts. So you have many people in leadership positions that really don't have that exposure to early proficient students in their schools and the instruction they need. English only policies in Massachusetts. In 2002, we passed English only policies here in Massachusetts, and that really did elevate a lot of, that anti-immigrant, we only speak English. If you speak English, that means you're American, type of dynamic in our schools. And we're still working to reverse those mindsets, right? We're still working to really reinforce that, it's important that people are multilingual, that our multilingual learners and their families are bringing so many incredible assets to our communities, and that they shouldn't have to give up something to be English speaking, right? I grew up in a Greek immigrant home, spoke Greek as a first language, and I knew at a very young age that I only needed to speak English. And now I no longer speak any Greek because that was the system that I was raised in. I've also noticed, and I do this research on educational opportunities and Department of Justice settlement agreements, and since 2016, the cases focused on multilingual learners is higher than any other group in educational opportunities. So it's really something that we're seeing nationwide in terms of students not having their needs met in our schools, which we also see sometimes in that data set that Anne presented. So I kind of have two mantras, and if you can see the top of my computer, you'll see both of them. One is Si se puede, so yes, we can, from Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta. I got to see Dolores Huerta at a conference at La Cosecha. She was 94 years old. She's about 4 feet, 8 inches tall. She was presenting and advocating, and she had the whole place chanting Si se puede, and it's a memory I will never forget. But we really do need to come from a place that we believe that we can make these changes, that we believe that our students can be successful, that we believe that we can have the supports that they need, that we can be collaborative with people and recognize that there's resistance and still move forward. There is a quote in the Massachusetts DESE Blueprint for English Learners, which I love. It says, district leaders and school committee messages a clear, no excuses mentality for adults when it comes to the success of English learners. Too often, we're not centering students and their needs because of the comfort level of adults. And it's important for us to really recenter the needs of our students so that we can see those success metrics really change. I will also say it's important to have shared ownership and not just rely on your ML staff and directors, and not just be a seat at the table, right? Because I've been at many tables where it's been a checkbox, right? But the voice is not valued, right? And is not elevated. And that's important for leaders to recognize. And then the other quote from Martin Luther King Jr., again, is progress, right? How do we make progress? Because when there is resistance and bias in work and education, sometimes avoidance is the default, right? And we really need to be active in learning and growing and sometimes making mistakes, right? But the more we avoid the topic, we'll be in the same place in 5 years. So in Woburn, what I say to folks is, we're having these conversations now, and it's really important because if we don't make progress now, in 5 years, we could be at 30%, and we haven't taken those 5 years of work and progress to make the changes that we need to make. And people are on board, and the more we learn, people are like, oh, I didn't learn that. I didn't know that. Or I was taught this, right? So we have to re-educate ourselves to serve the students that we have in our schools today. And then I just added some quick references, some quick ways for people to learn more, listen to podcasts, read articles. There's so much out there on social media. And if our social media feed or the things that we're reading provides that perspective, it's the first step for more people to change their perspective on how to meet the needs of our multilingual learners in schools. So that's all I have. I will stop my share and happy to answer any questions.
All right, questions, comments? Nazra, I know you had a question.
Yes. Hi, good morning, Marianne. I am
morning.
not sure I missed your introduction, but my question is, and I'm glad that now I have a question before one speaker. My question is, these both speakers have really, really academic research, which is wonderful, and new information and connect. My two questions. One is how these two research connect with community discrimination, which is your, Marianne, your AI every time we discuss with the discrimination.
Mhm.
That, how do we connect this academic research with the community discrimination? And second question is, do we share this research outcome to the community we're talking about? It seems like, I mean, to me, it's only academic and who deal with the academic issue, but I wonder whether the community, the immigrant community we're discussing in this topic, do they know this research outcome, or do we share with them? And then after, if I have time, I wanted to share my immigrant parents, how I did with my child many years ago. So that's later, but I wanted to see if this connection we see. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I don't know who wants to.
Yeah, I mean, I'll jump in quickly, at least with families. I mean, when I meet with my advisory councils, the first thing I always do with our families is make sure that they understand their rights as families, and what rights their students have. Because I think too often our families feel like it's so nice that my kids just get to come to school, right? And it's those, we're trying to make those shifts with families too, in terms of what they should expect and what they should know about their kids in schools. In the community, we also feel like when we meet with community members, the systems themselves are similar, the context is different, right? So the context of school is different than what people are facing in the communities, but the systems in terms of like language access, for example, right? That's something that our families often deal with in schools, and they may also deal with, you know, in city government, for example, or in community spaces where they're finding resources.
Great. Other questions, comments?
I had a question for Dr.
Sure.
Mantel. I know that this previous study just focused on high school, but is there any discussion or thought of doing the younger years to collect that data and kind of see where kids are going if they're coming in, say, in elementary school, to see how the outcome of maybe the graduation rates go up? I'm unclear, but is there possibly other studies that are coming up with different age groups?
Yes, yeah, I think our hope is certainly to extend the research to look at younger students. Right now, we're working on a follow-up report to the one I just shared, which is looking more at district variation for high school newcomers. So how do high schools around the state handle, for example, placing newcomers in grades and in courses and in EL programs, and how do newcomers' outcomes vary by district? So we're working on that right now, and then, you know, my hope is certainly that shortly thereafter we'll turn to looking at younger newcomers. One of the things we're hearing is that, and again, this is just anecdotal, and you all may know more about this than I do, but we've been hearing that a number of the families who are arriving now, particularly the Haitian families, are coming with younger children. And so, they're not necessarily showing up in the high school data as much. But I think if we, start to move that age that we're looking at down, we will see some real shifts that aren't showing up in the high school data. So we're very, very interested in doing that.
Thank you. Reverend Lloyd, do you have another question?
Yes, for Ramona Caldwell, thanks for your presentation. I was excited to see that you have got at least 400 of your teachers who professional. Are we doing measurement in terms of those actual teachers? And they're, taking those courses in professional development, and that it really is impacting, which is in essence the structure of your education environment.
Yeah, so we did have them, we did survey them at the end of their course. And now the next step is we're working with schools and principals, and we're talking about how we're supporting our teachers with like coaching support and walking through classrooms and having those conversations. Because teachers with multilingual learners, they feel like new teachers, and it's really uncomfortable. So it's about building them up and supporting them in that work. And we're working on a plan to continue that. Yes. Definitely.
Well, thank you both. That was really fascinating information. It'd be very interesting to see as we get more recent data, kind of where we're going with that. Thank you all for being here. Our next meeting is June 13th at 10 o'clock. If you have thoughts, excuse me, about topics or presenters, please feel free to let Antonia know that. And have a wonderful Mother's Day.
Oh,
So
just
take
before,
care.
Mary, I
sorry.
think Nazda
Thank
had
you.
one more comment she wanted
Oh,
to.
I'm sorry.
Not-
Nasa, did you have another
Yes,
question?
and I wanted to make very short. I mean, I will. That was in 1990s in Newton Public School. My daughter was an elementary school student, 5th grade, and she was pretty bright and very involved with extracurriculum activities. So she was a part of the Girl Scouts cookie sale. So I took her in the neighborhood to sell the biscuit. So I was inside one of the home. The elderly woman was there, and my daughter just asked from the door. We didn't even go inside. She was sitting by the door, and she asked whether she wanted to buy cookies or not. She said no. So we left that time. So surprisingly, in 2 weeks, Newton Police was in my home and asking about, I was with any further information. The Newton Police in the evening, I was doing, cooking my dinner and knocked the door, and the Newton Police was in my living room and asking about my daughter. And I said, yeah, she is, and I brought her from her study room. And the issue was that elderly woman lost some jewelry from her home. And when she reported to the police station, I don't know what she did, but she probably mentioned with my daughter's name that she came to her home. And so then police took the interview, and the school principal was really supportive. Say, this is not happened. This is a good kid. And so I just wanted to share that sometime that connection with the community discrimination comes to school. I was involved, experience, and my daughter was, because I don't know whether because I was immigrant or the woman, I don't know, but I felt like this could be a kind of discrimination for immigrant students. Thank you.
Well, I'm sorry. That's exactly the kind of experience that makes people feel like they don't belong, that we're trying to really target.
And that was in Newton school system, it's a very well, affluent school system, right. And that happened, So I'm just throwing out that it might happen to other people too, so, in a different way.
Right. All right. Thank you. Enjoy the weekend. Happy Mother's Day. Take care. Bye-bye.
Happy Mother's Day. Thank you.
Thank you.